Great pleasure to introduce Ken Corvo, who is very modest and sent me a very short introduction. Dr. Corvo's work in the field of family violence began in 1984 as a director of a child abuse prevention agency in Cleveland. His doctoral study at Case Western University focused on identifying how disruptions in early childhood attachment were associated with the perpetration of domestic violence in adulthood. It is this work which brings him here today. And it is this which informs his most current work directed toward integrating findings from research on general violence into domestic violence theory development. So please join me in welcoming Ken Corvo.
Oh, you left the mic at the correct height. Thank you. Good afternoon. I prepared 54 slides for this afternoon's presentation, so I decided to edit it down, and I got it down to 57. So, to cover the task of early life risk for domestic violence perpetration, I thought, well, I'm going to tell you folks everything you need to know. Unfortunately, all my colleagues that came before me already did that. So I'm going to give a little bit of an improvisational interpretation of my presentation, if that's okay. Skip over some of the things you've heard repeatedly over the last couple of days, and highlight a couple of other things that are unique to domestic violence work. I'd like to ask first, who is currently working in domestic violence, partner violence, or who has in the past? Can I see hands, please? Yeah, good sprinkling of folks, good. Because there are some issues in policy and in practice in domestic violence that are sort of baffling if you haven't been exposed to them in the past. So I'm going to go through some of that to highlight what some of those policy and practice issues are and how those policy frames has shaped inquiry into domestic violence. First, I'd like to begin with defining some terms. Often you hear domestic violence described as battering, and persons that do that are batterers. This is a term that you find in government publications, Department of Justice, state offices, and many agencies use that term. Battering suggests a certain kind of domestic violence, principally male to female, unidirectional, and it is associated with other range of power and control tactics. You see this illustrated diagrammatically in the power and control wheel, which is emblematic of how a number of agencies think about domestic violence. There's very little evidence that description of domestic violence actually applies to very many perpetrators. This pie chart is derived from the national survey that was done by Murray Strauss and Richard Gellis in the 70s and replicated again in the 80s. And it is percentages of different sorts of partner violence of the total number of persons who responded as having perpetrated domestic violence in the last year. So the largest pie slice, the sort of greenish one, is mutual minor violence. And that's 36% of persons who responded to a national survey that engaged in any domestic violence was mutual minor violence. The next slide over, female minor violence about 12%. Male minor violence, about 14%. Mutual severe violence, and I'll talk about the measurement that was applied to this. It's the conflict tactic scale, and it has specific items describing escalating severity of violence. So 12% were mutual severe, involving beatings, use of weapons, and so forth. Female severe, 12%. Many people are surprised to see that male severe violence is less than female severe violence at 8%. And we now know, subsequent to the Strauss and Gellis research studies, that same-sex domestic violence occurs in roughly the same rates that heterosexual domestic violence occurs. So these are percents of all persons that have reported domestic violence in a calendar year, in a 12-month year, plus an additional specification for same-sex violence. The term intimate partner violence is used increasingly. Domestic violence is still a preferred term across various vectors of the literature. Domestic abuse, domestic violence, in state statutes, those are sometimes used to describe other forms of intrafamilial violence. The most commonly used measure is conflict tactic scale. It is I believe it's an 18-item scale that begins with pro-social kinds of conflict resolution as item 1 and ends with the use of weapons in item 18. And persons have sort of a variation of a sort of a lighter compressed range scale to respond. That gives you a rough quantification of the number of acts of domestic assault taking place in a year. So the primary places where domestic violence perpetration has been studied are in perpetrator treatment programs and in sort of national or non-clinical samples. Neither one of these two samples support construct validity for the term batterer. Persons who are arrested for domestic assault, some sort of domestic violence, they're not arrested for battering. However, if they are convicted, placed on probation or some sort of diversion and referred, they refer to batterer treatment groups. And the implications of being referred to a batterers group, I'm just going to sort of deconstruct that a little bit later. Depending on the year, depending on the jurisdiction, the rates of arrest are roughly 4 or 5 to 1 male to female across states. Just as sort of an aside, the issue of racial characteristics of perpetrators is very difficult to find at a national evidence level. However, several states and a couple of local jurisdictions have looked at the race of perpetrators and have found roughly that being black is a 6 to 8 time risk for being arrested or being a victim of domestic violence. And so being black is actually a greater risk for being arrested for domestic violence than being male. The national surveys, the large national surveys, found equal levels of perpetration for males and females on 2 large-scale applications, 4% severe, 11%, including minor acts like pushing. When this data was first released out of the Family Research Lab at the University of New Hampshire, people were stunned to find that the rates of perpetration, at least as defined by the conflict tactic scale, on a national representative sample were identical, and those numbers were roughly replicated 10 years later at the second administration of the survey. Some persons were so upset that Murray Strauss, his house was threatened to be bombed, and one of his doctoral students was told that a terrorist called and said her child had been abducted. That's how upset people were at the time. This is a distribution of conflict tactic scale scores from a perpetrator treatment sample, and as you can see, I hope, to the left is the fewer number, to the right the more, and you see the severe skewing. So in effect, the majority of persons, even in treatment for domestic violence, reported a relatively few number of acts in the year prior to their intake into programs. The common way of thinking about domestic violence in the sort of policy practice paradigm that I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly is that it is a strategy for male domination that involves various tactics and is socially supported through institutional arrangements and so forth. Another view of it is that learned behavior comes via social learning theory, intergenerational transmission. I don't think either way of thinking about that is very useful for treatment, so I've come to see it as a primitive coping strategy, and that it's a maladaptive and destructive way of managing oneself under conditions of stress. Symptomatic disorders of impulsivity, neuropsychological impairment, as we've heard sort of repeatedly over the last several days, emotional dysfunction activated within the context of intimacy or primary relationships, usually, if not often, exacerbated by substance abuse or dependency. That view is supported by the literature on risk that I'll be looking at in a more abbreviated form than I planned. This is where the sort of politics, policy, and ideology of this may seem a little unusual to people that aren't familiar with the field. The policy apparatus vertically sort of begins with the Department of Justice as the policy custodian for domestic violence perpetration work. They're a conduit for the Violence Against Women Act money and set the stage for overseeing pass-through funds to the states and then subsequently the local agencies. And the guidelines they put out sort of shape how people think about this, as well as what happens at the state policy level. So I just want to read a couple of the things that are forbidden by states who have the oversight responsibility for determining which perpetrator treatment programs will be allowed to go forward and serve persons who have been referred by judicial decision. So some of those things are anger, stress, family of origin influence, traumatic brain injury, trauma, mental illness, and addiction. All of these things we know to be associated in some way with violence, and in some cases known directly to be associated with partner violence. So it may seem puzzling that things for which there is empirical support are forbidden by a policy framework from being part of how one goes about working with perpetrators. And I'll give you an example of this to illustrate. The shelter in Syracuse runs a perpetrator treatment program, and a couple of years ago they decided to add 2 components to their standard treatment model. I'll talk about the standard treatment model again shortly. Those 2 components were anger management, a fairly meat and potatoes approach to anger management, and the second was they were going to now allow persons into the group who were self-referred. That is, they would come and say, I want help with my violent behavior, can I come into a group? When the state of New York found out that the shelter had made those alterations in their approach, they told them to stop or their funding would be cut. And they said, well, we want to serve people who want to be served, and they said, fine, and they eliminated their funding. Now, most of us know that persons who self-refer are the sort of gravy of our clients. And people, they're already motivated, they're already sort of along the way, and might be easier to work with. Under this sort of framework, those people are seen as undesirable because the assumptions embedded in the policy model lead one to conclude that only coercion can change violent behavior. And in fact, the policy statements from the Department of Justice say that programs should fully utilize the coercive power of the criminal justice system in the treatment of domestic violence perpetrators, which means that a self-referred person is not subject to that coercion. Therefore, in this kind of through the looking glass world, they're seen as undesirable clients, and attempting to serve them result in termination of funding from the State Office of Domestic Violence Prevention in New York. And while I'm beating up on them, I'll continue. And if you want to verify these sort of policy frameworks, there's a website. Its acronym is BISCMI. It's an acronym, BISCMI, and it links to all of the certifying agencies of all states. So you can go there and look at what the state policies are regarding what is permissible in working with domestic violence perpetrators. So this can be verified. The state of New York, in their recent iteration, has a section that says that traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder are not causes of domestic violence, but rather are excuses that perpetrators will use to justify their violent behavior. Right? So maybe this weekend, you have some free time, go look at some of these websites and you'll get a fuller flavor of the sort of distortions that I'm talking about. How does this play out in terms of governmental funding? National Institute of Justice made no grants for the purpose of studying risk, etiology, or developmental factors in perpetration of domestic violence in a 12-year period. I haven't checked since. I don't imagine there was a breakthrough. None of the NIH institutes made any R01 grants. That's the primary grant mechanism in the institutes for the study of developmental risk for the perpetration of domestic violence within the past 5 years. They have a searchable database. You might want to also, while you're looking at certifying agencies, look at this weekend. What we find more commonly is that the exposure to domestic violence is a risk factor for impacts on children. We've already had some discussion of that over the last couple of days. That is fundable, and you see often a focus of study. So how did this come about? Brief historical view. The emergence of domestic violence as a policy issue comes out of the intersection of the second wave feminist movement in the 70s and 80s, the victims' rights movement intersecting with a shift to conservative views of law and order, sometimes referred to as the punitive era. So you get this sort of strange bedfellows arrangement between feminism and conservative views of crime that create this sort of odd but intersecting view of what motivates persons to do crime. And that motivation has to do with holding perpetrators accountable in a blaming way, disregarding known empirical ideological factors leading to criminal behavior. And this shared interest in viewing crime that way has created this odd sort of, what do you call it, alliance? I just call it intersection. And when you look at the statutes concerning domestic violence perpetration, you see that it resembles more sort of traditional conservative law and order views than it does notions of progressive feminism. So there's a policy interest that directs persons away from psychosocial risk. We don't want to get into a position where we're excusing behavior by examining ideological processes that lead to it. Right? So that's sort of the shared conservative feminist view. We don't want to excuse the behavior. If we start looking at these things, we're concerned that it'll become an excuse, it'll become exculpatory, and therefore we'll lose sort of the important framing of this issue. Partially as a result of that, domestic violence perpetrators, the policy framing has encouraged or permitted something that I call vilification, a way of viewing perpetrators as particularly unworthy, sort of from the scapegoating literature and from the sort of phenomenological view of social welfare policy, the way we frame the help seeker affects what we do about it. And this has led to an acceptance of depiction of perpetrators that we would not accept in any other sort of client group. So, in a book, 1998, I believe it was a factor analysis extracting characteristics of perpetrators. They were described as either pit bulls or cobras, referring to those, I think, who are more reactive and those that are more strategic, but using animals as symbols for humans. And what I would suggest is if you were to take some of those same acts of behavior, instead of a husband toward a wife, a mother toward a child, the same acts of severity, brutalization, we would not permit, and I don't think the editors of these books would have permitted to call them animals. Yet we accepted it in terms of domestic violence perpetrators. In a study of men in prison for perpetration, men were referred to as monsters. And the term intimate terrorist has taken on sort of a little bit of momentum, and you find it surfacing in descriptions in other typological studies where men primarily are seen as terrorists willing to destroy out of some sort of vindictive purpose. So, the current theoretical views of domestic violence are what I call feminist sociocultural, intergenerational transmission, and psychological psychosocial. Feminist sociocultural view has led to a treatment approach, an analytical approach called the Duluth model. How many of you know the Duluth model? You've heard of it in practice, you know about it. It came out of the Duluth Abuse Intervention Project in the 80s. It has zero empirical support for efficacy, but it's become the dominant framework for undertaking work with perpetrators in the United States and Canada. As another aside, efforts to evaluate Duluth and Duluth-related models have repeatedly shown zero to minuscule effect sizes, yet this is the mandated approach that is basically completely ineffective. Intergenerational transmission is social learning theory-based. Children observe violent behavior in the home. They integrate it through observation, internalization, replication. It becomes part of how they conduct themselves in life. Psychological, psychosocial is where I think most of the important work is being done. And we've gone through quite a bit of that already over the last couple of days. I'll just mention these in passing. I won't get too down into the weeds here. Personality disorders, neurobiological factors, neuroanatomical factors, insecure attachment, cognitive distortion, and PTSD. There's empirical support for personality disorders, severe depression, alcohol, substance dependence, and abuse, head injury, frontal lobe deficits, and PTSD. There's empirical support for these things being associated with domestic violence perpetration, despite the policy framework that explicitly forbids these things from being considered. I want to talk about subtypes just briefly so I can move on to the subset called that I call family-only domestic violence. And so these batterer typologies are based on perpetrator treatment samples. A number of features are examined: personality features, mental health features, severity violence features, and they tend to cluster in 2 or 3 types. The 2 that I'm going to focus on are the generally violent. The person is assaulted of their partner, they're also generally violent. And the person that is partner-only violent, they're not violent outside of their relationship with their partner. And so I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about the general risk, but it's already been covered, and I noticed when some of my other colleagues were presenting, some of them were sleeping, so I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to hit them quickly and then move on to family only. So about a quarter of the persons in these studies are identified as generally violent or antisocial. These are persons that are sort of higher in sociopathy. They're just as likely to hurt someone in the community as they are at home. These persons are persons that, if we were to map the construct batterer onto them, these are the folks that would be most likely to contour around that idea, yet they are not uniquely partner-only violent. So what does domestic violence, partner-only domestic violence, share with violence in general, and what is different about it? I'm fairly safe in saying that just about everything you've heard about risk for violence in general has some significance for domestic violence perpetration. Everything from sort of genetic-based neuroimmunological risk to sort of early socialization, and then the things that predict violence predict domestic violence, with a couple of exceptions that I'll get to. A study from the Duncan cohort study found that generally violent persons and family-only violent persons shared risk. However, the family-only persons were believed to be sort of less subject to risk and had sort of a greater ability to constrain what they did, and attributed that to better socialization. The persons that were partner-only assaulted seemed to be not quite as impaired and had greater sort of self-control than people that were generally violent. And you can get the citations out of the articles, look at the Infant Mental Health Special Edition and get all the background on this, but family-only perpetrators are more reactive to stress and partner aggression. And Richard was talking about assortative mating earlier today. I'm going to make reference to that as well. Part of the difficulty in identifying early life risk for domestic violence, unlike early life risk for other forms of violence, is that domestic violence doesn't actually occur until later in the life cycle. You can observe violence in general in children, adolescents, but domestic violence requires sort of partnering, reaching a point in adolescence or adulthood where one has secured a partner. The sort of most proximal risk factor then developmentally is dating violence. I think that was, Sarah, were you talking about dating violence earlier? Yeah. The rates of dating violence are actually higher for females than males. And that was, I think, Murray Strauss's last study before he died was an international study of dating violence. And he found that true in some great number of nations that he studied, that female perpetration of dating violence is greater than male perpetration in most countries. So early life maltreatment, exposure to violence, attachment problems, interacting with genetic risk, create a primary developmental susceptibility to subsequent life course risk for domestic violence. The severity of that risk has implications for generally violent or family violent outcomes, the latter perhaps often arising within stressful and highly conflictual relationships. This seems to be one of the things that differentiates family-only from generally violent. That persons that are family-only tend to be in relationships that are high stress or high conflict. So what are some of the things that we might identify as being relevant to family-only? Some of the things that we've heard about earlier: genetic risks, interparental violence, abuse, maltreatment, and attachment problems. In a study from the Ad Health data set, using twin data, genetic factors accounted for 24% of variance in striking a partner and 54% of variance in injuring a partner. We've heard about MAOA and the serotonin transporter gene as well. Those factors seem to be associated, those genetic factors seem to be associated with domestic violence perpetration as well. Again, MAOA in another study. The MAOA effects seem to be most problematic for males who are the low expressive side, who are also subject to maltreatment in childhood. It's the interactive effect of maltreatment, abuse, and so forth with low expression of MAOA that leads to a greater risk of aggressive behavior. And that's found in domestic violence perpetrators as well. Skip that. So the question is, what's the role of interparental violence? So the social learning theory view, the generational transmission view, is that children were watching their parents engage in violent behavior, therefore learning violent behavior through the mechanism of parental violence or child abuse. And studies that look at that exposure often find statistically significant but weak effect. So the question is, what is it exactly that's going on as a child is observing parental violence? And it would appear that it may not primarily be social learning theory driven, but neuropsychological impacts of fear and trauma from being assaulted and from observing caregivers assaulting each other. And so the studies that infants exposed to high accumulated interparental violence show increased cortical activity and adrenocortical dysregulation as early as 2 months. We also find that elevated cortisol occurs in men who are in domestically violent relationships where violence is occurring, where there's a partner hostility. In a prospective longitudinal study, exposure to interparental violence in toddler and preschool could predict both domestic violence perpetration and victimization at age 23. So what we're going to see is that there's this sort of similarity in etiology for perpetration and victimization. Some of the variability in how females and males respond to early life sorts of stress may explain part of that. But there's kind of an equifinality in how persons find each other, form relationships that become high stress and then become problematic or violent. Abuse and maltreatment. The problem with studying abuse and maltreatment in young children is that much occurs in the lifespan between that and adult or adolescent mate selection. So part of the problem is, how do you isolate early effects of abuse and maltreatment? One study found an aggregate measure of severe physical child abuse measured at age 2 and again at 6 found a correlation with both physical perpetration and victimization at ages of 21 and 23. However, other variables, for example, parent-child boundary violations in adolescence occurred later, had a stronger statistical association. The difficulty then is isolating those effects on something that doesn't occur until later in life. So I looked at some studies that may have some sort of explanatory use in looking at adult offending. The support is mixed for some of these things. The one study out in the yard et al. Concluded that a measure of cumulative risk in early childhood better predicts adolescent behavior problems, including externalizing behavior, better than do individual risk factors, which I think is a way we need to think about domestic violence perpetration. What is the sort of load of risk that the person carries? Not do we isolate, child abuse or inter-parental violence and so forth, but what is happening to that person through their life course that leads them to that sort of discontrol or violent orientation, responding to partner sorts of issues. One study, and this study was funded through NIAAA. After I said no one funds it, this study by George et al. Found abnormalities in neural pathways and brain structures of alcoholic perpetrators. And the only reason that was funded is because it was a sample of persons with alcohol dependency. The domestic perpetration stuff was taken as sort of a side bet, data that was collected as a side bet and subsequently analyzed, so it wasn't framed as a domestic violence study. And they found abnormalities in brain structure. So, individual developmental risk for adult domestic violence perpetration, beginning with genetic early life factors, then intersects with the developmental trajectories of one's intimate partner, creating a dyadic negative synergy of risk. To briefly go back to the notion of the sort of dating or sort of partnering, I believe Sharp is talking about it in terms of mental health issues. The persons with similar mental health profiles find each other. I think it's that and more, that people identify in each other, a certain similarity, a certain orientation toward life. Perhaps it's even sort of lodged in an attachment process that I'll talk about shortly, where they partner with persons that share some of the issues they have. So persons that grew up in violent homes partner with people that grew up in violent homes. People that have sort of an anxious attachment posture find people that have anxious attachment, or other sorts of attachment issues. They form these relationships, and it makes a sort of alchemy of stress. I want to talk about attachment theory just briefly. Bowlby had actually looked at an attachment-based framework for family violence, and he said, quote, "The behavior of men who ill-treat girlfriend or wife," and he used case studies to support that view, saying that he thought it was parental violence and neglect that created patterns of anxious attachment in both perpetrators and victims, and the utilization of violence instrumentality is an instrumentality to prevent or head off abandonment or the fear of abandonment. You can't leave me. So some of what we talk about is power and control motives in perpetrators may not be as much motivated by one's seeing another as an object of ownership, but rather as an attachment object whose departure is inconceivable. Oh, this is a study I did. This one I'll go into detail. I'm giving myself too much credit in a minute. Corvo found that aggregate childhood and adolescent separation and loss events had the strongest bivariate correlation with severity of adult violence perpetration in the sample of perpetrators, more so than exposure to violence in the family of origin. So in bivariate analysis, separation and loss events was actually more strongly associated with severity of violence than were violence predictors, including observation of parental violence and child abuse. When we sort of nested it into some multivariate analysis, it hung in there. It hung in there in the best predictor models as a strong predictor, primarily when holding other things as constant. So there's sort of something about attachment disruption leading to violence that has perhaps its own pathway into it. So I'm just going to freelance a little bit here about what I would see the sort of dual effects of attachment disruption. That is, we know that poorly bonded children, erratic caregivers, experience separation loss, and all these kinds of things at key developmental points suffer a general sort of psychological consequence for that. less ability to inhibit arousal and all these other things. But attachment disruption has its own particular specific relational impact as well, not just sort of a general sort of risk, but it affects how persons go into relationships and how they are in relationships. And that we know that attachment is fairly persistent through life. They get formed relatively early, and they provide sort of a core structure, right? So, in addition to the general sort of effects of attachment problems, we have specific issues which have to do with how these different attachment styles play out in tandem with persons who have attachment issues who may also have been exposed to violence, right? So it leads to partner choice. It leads to dysfunctional sorts of interactions. It leads to difficulty in being emotionally stable enough to withstand the conflicts of intimacy without resorting to primitive approaches to resolve these things. Perpetrator and partner attachment anxiety predicted physical assault and psychological aggression independent of gender. Perpetrator attachment anxiety in tandem with partner attachment anxiety, but with overall lower levels of perpetrator psychopathology, maybe but differentiates family only from general violence. So I was going to talk about implications for practice and policy, and I still am. I made an assumption during the work that I do. Is that 15 minutes for questions or 15 minutes altogether? Oh, crap. I'll wrap it up. So I made this assumption that eventually the science on violence is going to penetrate into the program officer's consciousness at the Department of Justice. And they were going to go, we can't keep this stupid model going any longer. The science is overwhelming. Has anyone been keeping track of what's happening in the Department of Justice? So now I'm not sure where to go with this. That was my plan. I'm going to retire in 2 years. I think I'm out of time. So if anybody else wants to go with that strategy, help yourself. Maybe things will get better over time. Oh, one more minute. I'm not done yet. That was a pause. It's a pause. Holy crap, we're getting played off the stage. So many damn slides. I'm done. Thank you. Any questions? Adrian, you have one job. Yes.
Hello. So on the Wikipedia article for Erin Pizzy, her name is spelled Pizzey. It says about her, Erin Pizzy is known for having started the first domestic violence shelter in Lockborough, Chiswick Women's Aid, in 1971, the organization now known today as Refuge. It goes on to say about her, Pizzy has been the subject of death threats and boycotts because of her research into the claim that most domestic violence is reciprocal, similar to what we were speaking, I think it was a bombing threat, a kidnapping threat, into the claim that most domestic violence is reciprocal, and that women are equally capable of violence as men. Pizzy has said that the threats were from militant feminists. She has also said that she is banned from the refuge she started. My question generally, without going too long, is I'm having a great deal of difficulty making any impact on people when I bring up this issue as an activist at the University of British Columbia. Corresponding to what you said about the gender trend from the University of British Columbia, when it comes to teen dating violence, boys are more likely to report being victims of violence, being hit, slapped, or pushed than girls. That's the surprising finding of new research from UBC and SFU. 5.8% of boys and 4.2% of girls said they had experienced dating violence in the past year. And I also met, this is the last point, with Don Lattin, who is a professor emeritus in psychology at UBC. I asked him after during our meeting, could you write me a letter with some of the statistics you read by me? And he says, several well-conducted surveys exist and show clearly and conclusively that the most common form of domestic violence is bilateral, matched for level severity, 50% of all domestic violence. The second most common form is female perpetrated domestic violence against non-violent males, 35%. Third most common, 15%. Sorry, go ahead. The question basically is, why does this make no impact? Is there any authoritative source? Because it doesn't seem to me that any number of numbers, I mean, Met has impeccable credentials. We have one current professor at UBC, we have one former professor at UBC. It doesn't matter the news coverage. When I bring this number, some people...
We have your question.
Yeah.
You got it.
So let me answer the question that you should have asked. Mike? Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well, yeah.
You can. All right. So, here's the question you should have asked. Why is social welfare policy irrational? That's the question you should have asked. So what I would suggest, you're a philosophy student apparently, go over to the social work school at UBC and audit a course in social welfare policy. It'll become very clear to you why social welfare policy is irrational. Could you too long to respond to?
Why it's irrational.
Yeah, why it's irrational.
It's too long to respond to.
I can't respond to the irrationality of social welfare policy in a question and answer period now. So I would say go on to class. It's a very complex issue. I think you'll find a satisfactory answer there.
Is it ideological corruption?
Some of them. Other questions?
So, Kenneth, do you have data on rates of perpetrated murder in the context of inter-parental violence of males on females, females on males? What do those data tell us?
Yeah, I haven't looked at it in a while. The uniform crime reports doesn't have a domestic violence partner data that I know of. What they have is murdered by an individual known to kind of thing, to try to differentiate that from community violence. My recollection is that the murder of men by women, maybe a fifth of what it is of men of women. Male victimization and community homicide is many, many times higher, so the overall homicide rate for men is much higher. Women are more likely to be killed by someone known to them, whether it's partner, brother, boyfriend, that kind of thing. I don't have the exact number, but something about 1,500 for men as perpetrators and 400 or 500 for women, but that's buried deep in some memory closet. Yeah.
You mentioned attachment theories playing some role in the development of policy, or at least understanding domestic violence. Now, over my course of years, I've probably read 100 papers on attachment theory, and during that time, it's always attaching to the mother. In other words, we very seldom see any reference to attachment being developed in regard to the child and the father. But we know that the biggest attachment disruptions these days are the absence of father. So I'm wondering if there are any correlations that you have between domestic felonious behavior for either men or women that are correlated with attachment disruption with the father. No. And this comes again to the distortions in our understanding of the situation. And
It doesn't get studied out. There's studies that look at criminality and single parenting. So that level we are studying. To bring it down to the attachment level, this isn't something that... The research that I'm presenting to you, I hope, illustrates that how underfunded domestic violence research is, and to try to get at sort of specific subtext of attachment disruption, I think is really I can't see that happening.
So that was why my note.
All right, so I really I just want to include attachment disruption from the father.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I found it interesting that you were talking about perpetrators, it being an issue of attachment, why they're dysregulating and becoming violent. So it's really weird. All 3 days we've been talking about community and attachment. We talked about the term that I brought up, reattachment, the possibility of reattachment. So let's say somebody has a healthy attachment, ages 0 to 5. They join the military at 18 years old. Is it possible that older attachments become weaker and then a reattachment comes, go out into service with these fellows, you lose this friend, you come back and get separated from your team in this military? Are they being traumatized through the loss of attachment figures? And then we kind of took that a little further into an abusive relationship, thinking, you look at a woman, is there an attachment being formed? Like there's isolation. Is there an attachment being formed in an abusive relationship? Kind of like you look at the military, they're isolated, they become dependent on each other for survivability, and then all of a sudden they're separated from those folks. Are they having a traumatic effect to the loss of attachment figure? And then moving forward to domestic violence. When we ask women, hey, leave it, are we actually asking them to traumatize themselves for the loss of an attachment figure due to the fact that they've been isolated, they become dependent, survivabilities, right? There's this own little community in the midst. So are we actually, as we say this to women or men, right? But as we say this to women, are we asking them to traumatize themselves for the loss of an attachment figure?
I think there's a lot of reasons that people stay in relationships that are dysfunctional and even violent. But what I've seen is that most women victims want to remain in a relationship where they've been hurt. They just don't want to be hurt anymore. Some of that, I'm sure, is attachment-driven. Some of that is economic. Some of that is family. So I think it's a more complex mix of things. But I do know that persons who are anxious attachment style find some relationships extremely frightening and extremely difficult to do without emotional distress.
Is there a possibility of forming new attachments, right? So let's say you have a healthy attachment with the family and you get with a cult or an abuser. Are you forming a new attachment with that person? Or are you still riding on the coattail of your previous attachment, 0 to 5?
I don't know. This is a very complicated question.
I just wanted to thank you, first of all, and secondly, to add a little bit of information. I doubt that you've heard of this because it was only released, I think, a month or two ago. But there is a new curriculum that is kind of replacing in some ways the old Duluth model. And it's from Family Peace Initiative, if anybody wants to learn about it. Family Peace Initiative. And they've just published the new curriculum, and they're going around the country and training people on this new curriculum that is based not on the more rigid Duluth model, let me say, but on understanding trauma that has happened for quote-unquote batterer lives, and doing that in a way that maintains accountability and responsibility. So it has a much more profound way of becoming deeply connected with the people who batter, and then their recidivism rate for their program is so much better than other programs. Family Peace Initiative.
Thank you.
I just wonder, and I wasn't able to actually see, when this study studies and the statistics were gathered? Because I'm guessing that they may have been within the last 30 or 40 years, the statistics on how many females to male or male to female, and so forth, the pie chart that you had, and if there's any difference between the last 30 or 40 years and perhaps earlier on, when we may have resembled more other societies in the world where I believe, and this is only a belief, that domestic violence may be more skewed towards males being the perpetrators. So I'm trying to understand, because we are a society in flux, and we are somehow, women have been fighting back in the last 30 or 40 years, let's face it, and maybe, post-World War II. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, these are expensive. These are expensive national surveys, and they done in the 70s, done in the 80s. The same data was replicated. I don't know if anyone else has replicated the Strauss and Gullis national surveys. If anyone knows that they have, let me know. I don't think they have. So we do know there are other indicators, like the arrest of women, the increase of girls in juvenile crime, that kind of thing.
You had a list of things that you said were prohibited from being studied for such things as intoxication is a quote-unquote excuse. But when you said, I think it was like 34% of violence is mutual, I'm going to take a while to guess that in many of those cases you're going to have mutually intoxicated individuals, particularly on alcohol. Is there any research that you know of regarding things like the relationship between alcohol abuse and the mutuality of aggression in couples?
I just got to wrap up notice. So what I'll say is there's similarity in risk for perpetration and victimization in terms of substance abuse issues, in terms of mental health issues, in terms of attachment profiles, and so on and so forth. How we make use of those things to do anything in treatment is another discussion that involves next conference. We'll do something about that. But substance use, alcohol particularly, is one of the prime predictors of both perpetration and victimization. Thank you.